recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 724, the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, or the PACT Act. I want to give special thanks to my Florida colleague, Congressman Buchanan. He is a long-standing friend of animals in Congress, and I'm thrilled that he agreed to introduce this bill with me to create a federal law punishing those who abuse animals. I also would like to acknowledge Congressman Holding and the hard work by groups like the Humane Society and Humane Rescue Alliance, who have helped collect 290 bipartisan co-sponsors for this bill. There are so many groups and people from across the country who have supported this bill, people like Lisa Vanderpump, who added her passionate commitment to animals to our effort, and groups who rescue animals literally in every corner of our country every single day. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank one person in particular, Mr. Speaker, a high school student, one who is so committed to helping animals, caring for animals, that when she learned about the PACT Act, she started an online petition hoping to collect a few thousand signatures. That petition urging Congress to pass this bill gathered over 729,000 signers. And I'm thrilled that that young activist, Sydney Helfand, is with us in the gallery today. Now, of all the divisive issues here in Washington, the PACT Act is one on which we can all agree. We must make animal abuse a federal crime. This bill has received so much bipartisan support because Americans care about animal welfare. We form deep relationships with our companion animals and are rightfully outraged by cases of animal abuse. Animal rights activists stand up for living things that do not have a voice. That's what the PACT Act does. Americans expect their law enforcement agencies to crack down on this horrific violence against animals, and law enforcement officers agree, which is why the PACT Act has been endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, and local law enforcement agencies across the country. They have asked for this federal law to bolster their efforts to target animal abusers because they understand the direct link between animal abuse and violent crimes. This link is why the FBI now collects data on acts of cruelty against animals for their criminal database, right alongside felony crimes like assault and homicide. When I first came to Congress, one of the first bills I voted on was the Animal Crush Video Prohibition Act, a bill that nearly unanimously passed. And it made it a crime to create or distribute Animal Crush videos which depict horrific acts against violence. This bill today takes the next logical step and criminalizes those acts underlying that crime as well. The Senate passed the PACT Act by unanimous consent in the last 2 Congresses, and I am proud the House is finally doing its part to pass this important legislation. Today, anyone who inflicts serious bodily injury on animals will be committing an act for which they should be condemned. When the PACT Act passes, they will also be violating federal law. I thank the Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support the PACT Act, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. As a point of note, the chair would remind members that unfortunately and regrettably, the rules do not allow references to persons, great Americans, in the gallery. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 724, the bipartisan Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, or the PACT Act, introduced by Representatives Ted Deutsch and Vern Buchanan. In 2017, Pennsylvania passed Libre's Law, which increased penalties for animal abuse. I was honored to help push that legislation over the finish line in the Pennsylvania State Senate. I'm proud to once again help pass legislation that will better protect our nation's animals. In 2010, Congress passed the Animal Crush Video Prohibition Act to address the trade in obscene videos of live animals being crushed, burned, or subjected to other forms of heinous cruelty. While this was an important first step, the law only bans the trade in video depictions of cruelty, not the underlying act of cruelty itself. The PACT Act addresses this gap by prohibiting the underlying acts of animal cruelty that occur on federal property or affect interstate commerce, regardless of whether a video is produced. As a former district judge, I served on the front lines of our judicial system. I witnessed firsthand the connection between animal cruelty and violence toward people. In fact, the FBI recently recognized that addressing animal cruelty is critical to protecting our communities. The PACT Act would give federal law enforcement and prosecutors the tools they need to combat extreme animal cruelty. This bill would give the FBI the authority to act against animal cruelty that is discovered while investigating another interstate crime, such as drug smuggling or human trafficking. The PACT Act would not interfere with enforcement of state laws related to felony animal cruelty provisions. The legislation focuses solely on extreme acts of animal cruelty and exempts normal agriculture and hunting practices. The PACT Act is endorsed by the National Sheriff's Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, as well as more than 100 law enforcement agencies. And in the Senate, the PACT Act is sponsored by my good friend, Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey. And it passed in both the 114th and the 115th Congresses by unanimous consent. In the House, it currently has more than 300 bipartisan co-sponsors. I urge my colleagues to support the PACT Act so we can better protect our nation's animals from abuse and torture. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Axney.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representatives Deutsch and Buchanan, for this bill. I'm very excited to be able to vote for it today. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the PACT Act and am grateful for the support that it has. As a longtime animal lover and advocate, somebody who worked to take care of the puppy mill issues that we've got in my own state of Iowa, I know more than anybody that there's nothing like bringing animals to the forefront that brings people together. This is absolutely a bipartisan issue. And while the Animal Crush Video Prohibition Act prohibits trade in obscene video depictions of live animals being tortured, as Representative Deutsch said, the bill did nothing to prohibit the underlying conduct of the cruelty itself. This is what the PACT Act does. It strengthens the Animal Crush video law by prohibiting animal cruelty regardless of whether a video is produced. There's documented connection between animal cruelty and violence to people. In fact, studies show animal abusers are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes against people, and it's linked to domestic violence as well as child and elder abuse. The PACT Act gives federal law enforcement and prosecutors the tools they need to combat extreme animal cruelty and to protect our communities at the same time. Whether it's the veterinarian in my own state of Iowa, ranked 49th when it comes to animal welfare laws, who was recently arrested for debarking dogs by shoving rod-like objects into their vocal chambers without anesthesia, or whether it's in my neighboring state of Nebraska, where a man was recently accused of severely burning a cat by holding it underwater, scalding hot water. Across this country, people are torturing animals, and it absolutely has to stop. So tomorrow, on Make a Dog's Day, which is in support of encouraging dog adoption, let's do these companion animal friends of ours one better by a unanimous vote for the PACT Act today and put an end to the horrible acts of cruelty that should not be allowed in this country. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to yield 4 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, I join with my bipartisan colleagues here to proclaim that animal abuse is unacceptable and must end, which is why we are all proud to be supporters and many of us original co-sponsors of the PACT Act, because it strengthens federal law regarding animal cruelty. And was previously mentioned, the Animal Crush Video Act of 2010 banned the creation and distribution of these despicable videos. However, it did not make the actual animal abuse itself a crime. The bipartisan PACT Act goes a step further and outlaws this malicious animal cruelty regardless of the presence of video evidence. And Mr. Speaker, as a former FBI agent, my agency's profiling studies demonstrated how violence against animals is a precursor to human violence. And that's why we're fighting aggressively against egregious animal cruelty and why it is so important. And law enforcement, including the FOP, strongly supports this legislation because it provides another tool for them to use for animal abuse cases that might otherwise go unprosecuted. More than 100 law enforcement agencies and organizations across our country have endorsed the PACT Act. We must come together and stand up for innocent, defenseless animals, which is why there are over 300, in fact 301 to be exact, co-sponsors, both Democrat and Republican, on this bill. I commend Senator Toomey, our colleague from Pennsylvania, for introducing the companion bill in the Senate. We must pass the PACT Act as soon as possible so that it can be signed into law, and we must make sure that this type of animal abuse no longer happens. Together we will end all types of animal cruelty, and we will continue to be a voice for the voiceless. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, the chairman of the Animal Protection Caucus and an original co-sponsor of the PACT Act, and a great voice for animals and animal rights, Mr. Blumenauer.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy and his leadership on this issue. It is a breath of fresh air for us in sort of, shall we say, troubled times in our nation's capital when there is so much discord and disagreement. And it seems we can't really agree on fundamental facts. Is today Tuesday or Wednesday? Animal welfare is one of those issues that brings people together on a bipartisan basis. I am pleased that the Bipartisan Animal Welfare Caucus has been involved in advancing this. Animal cruelty has been an area that I have been involved since the beginning of my tenure in Congress. We fought in farm bills for years to try and advance protections against animal cruelty. I am pleased that we are here today dealing with something that, Congress has already acted to make these provisions illegal. But what we haven't done is make it illegal to depict these horrific crush videos. It was horrifying when we brought that legislation to the floor for people to understand what some sick, sadistic people do in portraying these horrific acts of cruelty. What we find is that it is linked to larger issues. People who abuse animals are often linked to horrific instances of violence against their family and community. It is dehumanizing to us all, as well as, of course, to the cruelty that is involved there. We need to enact this legislation to make it illegal to have the depiction, the actual creation of the depiction of the animals being abused. This, for example, with the PACT Act, would allow for charges to be brought against a puppy mill operator who's drowning unwanted animals if he's engaged in interstate activity. It would take strides to protect our overall communities from violent crime. I would hope that this would also signal more activity on the floor of this House, because we have a range of legislation that is teed up and ready to go, that has broad bipartisan support. I appreciate the fact that we're getting 290 or whatever the number is, but life is short. We ought to be able to move these items with broad bipartisan support to the floor. We shouldn't necessarily be here just renaming post offices on a Monday. I mean, these are substantive issues that matter to people. We ought to be moving them through. I think this is an important first step, and I'm pleased to add my support to it. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, we are standing here today in support of the PACT Act to make it a crime to commit abuse that has already been detected in videos or that videos that we have made illegal. We need to render the acts illegal. We need to enforce detection. We need to support enforcement writ large, and we need to stand up for the rights of animals and to stand up against animal cruelty. I come from the great state of Michigan, and this is something that I have heard from my residents from all corridors throughout my district. We are home to great equine farms as well as other establishments that care for animals, and that is a message that we want to put forward. And we want to stop animal abuse on the front end and also stop other forms of domestic abuse that may arise from it. I led the Department of Justice appropriations process that directs the use of Department of Justice funds to enforce our nation's animal cruelty laws. And today, with the PACT Act, we are realizing another important step in protecting the rights of animals and stopping abuse before it starts. Thank you so much, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I am prepared to close, so I will reserve as well.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
I again just urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 724, the PACT Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we should do everything we can to prevent the torture of animals, to take steps to hold accountable those who would engage in such horrific acts. And the PACT Act is a significant federal measure to help put an end to the abuse of animals. I am thankful to be on the House floor at this incredibly gratifying bipartisan moment, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bipartisan bill. But finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge every companion animal that has brought love to my staff members since the PACT Act was first introduced. Those would be Thomas Jefferson, Desi, Stella, Doc, Bubba, Maple, Hazel, Cheech, Ollie, Frodo, Theo, Tiki, Tank, Enzo, Dino, Virgil, Rooney, Maybelline, Prudence, Nazca, Poseidon, Poseidon, Gus, Sansa, Tony, Dwayne Wade, and my dearly departed Jesse. For all of them and for every animal who brings joy to everyone in this chamber, let's do our part to prevent animal cruelty and torture, and let's pass the PACT Act.